This time we look at 5 middleweight or smaller two-strokes from the 1970s. These days, when people consider classic 1970s two-strokes, they usually talk about 750 triples and the larger capacities. There were some smaller and middleweight capacity bikes that are equally as classic and gave really great service to their riders. So here are 5 70s two-strokes with middleweight or smaller capacity engines. Yamaha's RD 350 and 400 air-cooled twins. These bikes were, of course, parallel twin air-cooled two-strokes with reed valve induction. The 350 came first in 1973, and that ran until 1975 when the 400 arrived a year later. The 399cc engine had a bore and stroke of 64 by 62. Compression ratio, as is typical with two-strokes, was fairly low at 6.2, but it still gave 44 horsepower at 7,000 RPM, claimed at least, which is enough to give the 6-speeder a top speed of around 105 miles an hour. The engines on both machines was a direct evolution of the previous R5 model. This had been a 5-speeder with drum brakes. The 350 had a single disc at the front and a drum rear on wire wheels. There was also rounded styling. The 400 had more angular styling and cast wheels and disc brakes front and rear, those stylish cast wheels being a first on a Yamaha. 78 would see CDI ignition as well as slightly redesigned cast wheels. There were also carburettor and porting changes, although in truth these were mainly to do with tighter emission and sound regulations. The RD made a great all-round package. It was light, nimble and compact, and was generally a much better bike than Kawasaki's KH400. The Quacker may have sounded better with its 3-cylinder engine, but the Yamaha turned better and was faster too. Production of the RD would run until 1979, but in 1980 it was replaced by the new LC model. The Suzuki T500. When you consider 1970s Suzuki two-strokes, your mind immediately goes to the GT series with their 3-cylinder engines, the 380, 750 and 550 models. Now the twins are often considered a little bit less exciting, a little bit less exotic. Nevertheless, they gave good performance at slightly lower cost than those 3-cylinder jobs. Now the T500 in fact dated all the way back to 1968 and was at the time the largest capacity bike that Suzuki produced. The very early 68 models had a bad reputation for ill handling, but Suzuki would move quickly and introduce a Mark II version with a lengthened swinging arm, which did improve matters somewhat. The Suzuki employed a 492cc air-cooled parallel twin two-stroke engine with a bore and stroke of 70 by 64. Peak power was a claimed 47 horsepower at 7,000 RPM, enough with the 5-speed gearbox to push the bike along at around 105 miles an hour. Later models would have reduced carb sizes to improve fuel economy, but the bike did have some mechanical failures. Suzuki were forced to change the barrels with revised porting and add extra cooling fins too. And pistons from the larger GT750 were used after piston failures were encountered on some models. In 76 the bike got a restyle, a mild detune to improve reliability and a disc brake, and that's how it would remain until the end of production. The Yamaha RD 125 and 200. At the lighter end of Yamaha's glorious RD range of the 1970s sat the 125 and 200cc twin-cylinder bikes. Both bikes were essentially seen at the time as commuter models, but their styling and basic layout mirrored that of the larger 350 and subsequent 400 models, giving them a bit of cachet value. The 125 would arrive in 1973 in drum brake form with wire wheels. The early model had more curved styling and produced around 15 horsepower. Top speed was claimed at around 80 miles an hour. Of course later models would gain the angular styling, a disc brake and a full-on 17 horsepower. This would of course be pared back when the 125 law came in Britain to just 12. Although of course by that time the bike was already being replaced by the liquid-cooled single-cylinder LC model. The smaller model ran a 124cc parallel twin engine with square dimensions of 43 by 43. Peak power on the later models was 17 horsepower at 8,000 rpm, while on the 200 it was 22 horsepower at about the same rpm range. Of course, in the 70s in Grand Prix, 125s were allowed to have twin-cylinder engines, and Yamaha would make great use of this in their advertising for the little bike. Although of course the machines were very different. Nevertheless, the Yamaha was nimble and fairly quick for its size. And of course, for the budget conscious, a single cylinder 125 was also offered. And of course, both bikes would remain popular as commuters throughout the 70s, being finally replaced by the liquid-cooled LC models in 1980 as those tight emissions and noise regulations began to bite. Kawasaki's KH 400 and 250 models. Kawasaki introduced its range of sporting 3-cylinder 2-strokes in 1968, the range at that time being topped by the notorious 500 model, the H1. The first 250 model, the S1, would arrive in 1972. Initially it was claimed to have 32 horsepower at 8,000 rpm, but this was later detuned to a claimed 28 horsepower to improve drivability and of course reliability. The S1 had a 5-speed gearbox, drum brakes and a top speed of around 95 miles an hour. Now the S1 ran until 1975 when it was replaced by the KH250. Now the KH was mildly detuned, and of course it did share its chassis with a much larger 400 model. Now the 400 ran a 404cc engine which produced a claimed 38 horsepower at 7,000 rpm, enough for just over 100 miles an hour. And of course, compared to the earlier bikes, the KH had an improved chassis, so it handled much better and had better power delivery characteristics too. The 250 ran the same chassis, disc brakes and all, and this made the bike rather heavier than the early S1, although again more user friendly. Both bikes would be phased out of production in 1980. The Suzuki Super 6 and Hustler. The Suzuki T20, also known as the X6 in the US or the Super 6 in the UK, arrived in 1966. It ran a parallel twin-cylinder engine and had an amazing 6-speed gearbox. The motor was a 247cc air-cooled parallel twin 2-stroke with a boring stroke of 54 by 54. Peak power was a claimed 29 horsepower and top speed was said to be just over 90 miles an hour, around 94 quoted in some publications. There will be an updated model in 1969. This was designated the Mark II in Japan but dubbed the Hustler in the United States. An Hustler name would be more widely used after the Mark II Hustler in 1970. This model would be dubbed the Mark III in Japan, slightly confusingly. Now later versions of the Hustler would claim 32 horsepower at 8,000 rpm, giving a slightly ambitious top speed of 105 miles an hour, if you believe the speedos of course. Whether you believe the claims or not, this was still a very quick bike, which was essentially learner legal in the United Kingdom at that time. The Hustler would remain in production until 1972, when it was phased out in favour of the incoming GT250, a model which, although it shared the same basic motor as the earlier Hustler, only claimed a top speed of 90 miles an hour, although this would be improved upon on the final X7 model. What collections of bikes would you like to see us do a video on? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.